Hi, good afternoon. These are the words for the win for August 9th and 10th that weekend. I just did the First Communion Mass. Two little girls, lovely little young ladies, received their First Communion. And then at 3:30 we have another Mass where two boys, Nate and Giuseppe, are going to receive their First Communion. And they're not bad. You can watch them on YouTube, I think. I don't know how that works, but I think you can watch them on YouTube. But I want to tell you about so it's important to remember that Matthew's Gospel, all the Gospels, were not written as biographies of Jesus. They're not historical narratives saying that Jesus did this, Jesus did that. I know that's how we hear them, and I know that's how they're preached, but that's not why they were written. They were written as a gospel, which is good news. That's what they were written as. And so the literary and spiritual geniuses that put them together, worked very hard to craft narratives, stories that could communicate the experience that they had with the Jesus of history, who suffers, dies, and is resurrected and becomes the Christ of the ages. And they had experience with that, and they wanted to communicate that experience. And so the stories that we find in the gospel are intended to be pathways into that experience. In Matthew's gospel this past July, Jesus talked a lot about parables and used parables to talk about the kingdom of God and the kingdom of heaven, and that heaven that Jesus talked about in the kingdom of God, as I've said in other posts, is not the heaven and hell that we learned from somebody in the third grade. That heaven and hell that they talked about has some theological merit, but not what we were taught. Believe me, Jesus is far more inclusive in talking about the kingdom. The nature of the kingdom is that it is a kingdom of righteousness, of justice, goodness, beauty, truth, reconciliation, forgiveness, healing. It's not an either-or kind of world. It's a world that's continually unfolding in the loving, creative breath of God's Spirit, which is still hovering over us. I mean, that's what I believe. And even though we have tough times, and they're getting tougher, and they're going to get tougher, I'm afraid, that Spirit is still hovering over us, breathing life into this world, breathing life into us. And last week we heard a story of after all the parables, Jesus, attracted a lot of attention, and people followed him. He went to pray because he needs to stay in touch with his own belovedness that he learned when he was baptized early on in Matthew's gospel, when the sky opened and said, "This is my beloved in whom I take great pleasure." Well, to stay in that belovedness, you got to take some time out of the hassle. You have to have some regularity to withdraw, to be able to accept the love that the Spirit of God is putting into the environment, the very air that each one of us breathes, the blood that circulates through our body, the emotions, the feelings. That's the Spirit of God is there, and we need to absorb that, allow it to touch us, really touch us. That's very difficult. And so Jesus has this story last week in Matthew's gospel of this whole bunch of people come, and they're in a deserted place, and it's getting night, and the disciples are getting anxious and say, "Send them away so they can go and buy something." And Jesus says, "No, you give them something." And they say, "Well, we don't have anything. We just have 5 loaves and 2 fish, 7, which is a symbolic number. We've got to remember that." And so Jesus says, "Well, give them to me." And he takes the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and he blesses them, he gives thanks, he breaks them, and he distributes them. And Matthew tells us they go to 5,000 men alone, not counting women and children. Now that story, I suggest, could be about many things, but it's about trying to encourage his disciples to come into touch with their own belovedness. They have within them the image of God, the name that God gave them, and they can bring that forth into this world. Through their agency, the kingdom comes. The kingdom doesn't come with some, magic fairy godmother and that sort of thing. The institutional churches hate to talk about the kingdom of God because it's, they want their kingdom, like we all want our kingdoms. We want to be lords of the manor, of our own manor. And so I remember once being in Rome with Bishop Gaughan, and years ago, he was our second bishop, and he had strokes, and he wanted to go to this meeting with the Pope, and I was the only one that would go with him. And so we went, and And I took him down to St. Peter's Square on a Sunday morning, and thousands of people are gathering for that blessing when the Pope comes out that window. It was John Paul in those days. And I just was shaking my head, and the bishop said, yeah, I know. Jesus said, follow me, but they didn't want to follow him, so they stopped here and built that. They didn't want to go where he was going. They wanted a kingdom, so they built this. And we all do that, don't we? All do. And but Jesus, in his disciples, in the teaching last week, tries to tell them, okay, you are the source of the kingdom. Don't look outside of yourself. Look within yourself. Come in touch with your own belovedness. And there's legions of people that have no sense of their own belovedness. They live with what they think are unutterable failures and limitations and flaws. And because they aren't able to utter them, they project them. That's where a lot of the hurt, the violence, the anger, the meanness, the suffering, the murder, the killing, that's where that comes from. When people are not in touch with their own belovedness, in spite of what they think, the judgments they make about themselves, the secrets they think they need to hide. It's a blessed event when you find someone that evokes the unutterable in your own life, someone that you can trust to receive what you utter that you thought was unutterable, and they receive it in a way that demonstrates love and care and understanding. That's a great gift. I hope you find that. So then today we have Jesus in this, he orders the disciples to get into a boat and cross the lake to the other side ahead of him. That's a strange scenario. He then goes back up the mountain to get back in touch with his own belovedness. He needs to do that. He needs to be apart. He needs to have time and space so he can allow that spirit of God's belovedness to move in him, in his blood, in the air he breathes, the blood that circulates, the feelings, the emotions, so that he can transform the anxiety and the fear and the bitterness and the resentment and the doubt. He can transform that rather than transmit that. He can transmit belovedness, but he needs to be a way to do that. Meanwhile, the disciples are out on the lake, and a storm blows up, and the wind is against them, and they're scared to death. And Jesus goes walking on the water out there, and that walking on the water is not some kind of miracle thing that people want to make it. That walking on the water is the reference to the Spirit of God that hovered over the abyss in the creation story of Genesis. And I believe I can demonstrate very clearly that what happens, that Spirit of Jesus, the Spirit of God, is still hovering over us, calling forth our belovedness, calling forth new life, calling forth fruitfulness from all of the sadness and decay and violence and misery and lack of mercy. Jesus' Spirit is he, when he died, he said he breathed his last. Well, that Spirit he breathed into creation. And that Spirit is still operative. And Matthew's Gospel wants us to try and understand, all the Gospels do, how that works. And so in this story, this strange story, he orders them across the lake, they get into a storm, and he walks on the water toward them. And they think it's a ghost. They get scared. Because their expectations of God's presence are not what they get. And Matthew wants us to understand that Jesus is the fullness of God's presence. And so it's coming toward them on the water. And, the disciples are terrified. And Jesus says, "It is I," which is a code for the New Testament or the Old Testament understanding when God says, "I am who am." It is I is the Greek translation of that. And Jesus says, "It is I. I am the fullness of the divine presence." And Peter said, "Well, if it is you, tell me to come and walk there." And so Jesus says, "Well, come, Peter." And Peter gets out of the boat and he's walking on the water. He's in touch with his belovedness. And then the winds get strong, the waves get rough, and he begins to sink. And he says, "Save me." And Jesus immediately lifts Peter, doesn't let him fall, doesn't let him hurt. And then he says to Peter, "Peter, you have little faith. Why did you doubt?" And that's not a judgment question. It's a discerning question. Let's figure out, Peter, why did you doubt? What was it that caused you to doubt your own belovedness and lose the intimacy you had with the divine power? And I'm not saying that the way God works is that he keeps us, makes us immune and so on. These are daily tasks to stay in touch with. That's why in Matthew's gospel, Matthew tells us he's repeatedly withdrawing. These are regular events we have to have in our life. However, it takes different forms. You may do journals, you may do walks, you may do sits. You have to have some regular practice that allows you to try and detoxify the environment, detoxify your anxieties, your fears, your resentments, your bitterness, those sorts of things, so that you can be in touch with your belovedness. And when you're in touch with your belovedness, you mitigate, you damp down a bit the fear, and but this teaching is pretty explicit in having us know that just taking the step, even though we will doubt, taking the step is in itself a step towards our belovedness. We don't have a one package project. Like a lot of institutional, conventional religion wants to give us a package and say, you get this package, and there you are. Now you're a good Christian. You got all this information about who's right, who's wrong, and all that stuff. That's artificial intelligence in my mind. Real intelligence comes from the working of the Spirit in our own hearts, our own minds, the goodness that we bring, the healing that we bring, the forgiveness that we bring, the understanding that we bring. But we need to operate out of our belovedness. If we don't, we're going to hurt other people. And so in this teaching today, Jesus is not condemning Peter. He's saying to Peter, let's take time and figure out why you doubted. And when you begin to figure out why you doubted, you begin to come more in touch with the image of God that is in you and in me, unique to each of us. That image, that name that God has given us, that spark, that soul, that is where we are, most who we are. I hope that makes some sense to you. You can think about that, but take some time and get in touch with your belovedness in spite of all the anxiety and sadness and fear and all those things. The painting behind me is a painting by a man named Andrew Ferris. I bought a couple for the parish, and then I have some myself. Andrew Ferris is a young man. I think he lives in Wyoming. I'm not sure. And I first came across him because he had one of his paintings was on the cover of Poetry magazine a few years ago, and I just like the geometric shapes and the colors he uses. He often will pose these paintings outside in different kinds of landscapes, wild landscapes. He will pose them out there, and I'm going to get fly all over me. But anyway, peace be with you.